Why do people reject Christ? I think it's because they don't know his language. I'm not speaking of Aramaic, but of his particular dialect in whatever language perhaps he may be speaking to us, whatever may be the language that we communicate to one another in. He is speaking on a different wavelength, a different version of that same language. In John chapter 8, verse 43, Jesus is talking to some people who spoke the same essential language that he did in Aramaic, first century Hebrew, and yet he says, "Why is my language not clear to you?" And the Greek word here can also mean dialect, and or accent, perhaps. We know that in the same language can sound very different depending on the region that a person is from, and sometimes they can sound so different that perhaps two people who speak the same language might not be able to understand one another or might struggle significantly. And Jesus says, because you are unable to hear what I say. Well, why is that? Jesus says, look, I've come from somewhere else. And now he's in Judea, according to John, while he's speaking these things. And perhaps they were thinking, oh, yeah, well, you're from Galilee and you use a different accent and you sound different from how we do, but we speak Aramaic. And yet Jesus says, no, I'm not from Galilee originally. I've come to you by way of Galilee, but I'm originally from God. I'm from the Father. As John had already said in John chapter 1, that the Word, Jesus, was with God and the Word was God. So Jesus is saying, look, my native land is the presence of God. And that I have sprung from God, in that I have been sent by him, and that his nature is the same as mine, that we share a common culture. Now he's saying, you guys aren't getting what I'm saying, but it's because you aren't from where I'm from. And so you can't understand me. He says, if you were, then you would, and that we would embrace one another because we'd have this in common. We'd have this shared identity, but we don't. And so if we skip down 2 verses to verse 44, he says where they're from. He says, you belong to your father, the devil. Wow, that's not very complimentary. For those who want to see Jesus as being always sweet and friendly and nice and comforting, he wasn't, and he's not. And he says, you're from your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. That is natural to you, that you are native to Satan's land and to the devil's land. And he says he was a murderer from the beginning and not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. And so Jesus is telling us what language, what dialect he speaks, and that dialect is truth. And the reason that they couldn't understand him was because they spoke a different dialect, and it is this: when he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So Jesus is saying that's your origin point. That's the language you speak. You are from lie land and you speak liese. And so you cannot understand my language, which is truth. So these must be pretty horrible people. Are they Satanists? Are they terrorists? Are they gang members and thieves and murderers? They aren't any of those other things, but they are murderers, according to Jesus. He says and yet these people are the best of the best. that it's not, Jesus isn't saying that you're somehow, that these people that he's talking to, that you're somehow fundamentally or specifically or uniquely flawed. These are actually the very best people on the planet at the time Jesus came, because they're the Jews, according to John 8:31. And we may, depending on your attitude and politically and all that, what you think about Judaism and the nation of Israel and all of that, that's not within the scope of what I want to discuss. But when a first century Jew talked about the Jews, they weren't saying that those were bad people. They were saying that those were the good people. In Genesis, or in Galatians chapter 2, Paul has this candid conversation with Peter, and he says, look, we are Jews by birth and not sinners of the Gentiles. And so even Paul, who was very much about the gospel and about leaving behind this kind of rabbinic Judaism, he also retained the idea that the world was divided into Jews and Gentile sinners, that the Gentiles were involved in literal bacchanalias, that they were involved in all kinds of immoral behaviors that especially a Judean Jew wouldn't even encounter, just by virtue of where he lived. But it was just assumed that they weren't going to be a part of those things. And so they were the Jews. They're not the real immoral folks of the day. And they're not just the Jews. They're not just those Pharisees that we've all come to disdain. These were the ones who had believed in him. These are the ones who were his disciples. And in fact, Jesus says, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. And so these were people who, if you'd ask them, are you a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth? They would say yes. And Jesus is saying, well, don't be so fast. Don't be so hasty. Yeah, you're going to have to hold on to what I'm saying. You're going to have to retain it. Then you can say you're my disciple. And if you do that, I've got a promise for you. And here's his promise. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Wow. I mean, what a wonderful promise. And that verse, even people who don't know the Bible, there are probably people out there, people who will even watch this video, who have always heard the truth will set you free, and they didn't even know that it came from Jesus. That this saying is so popular, so famous, that it transcended its original document and its original placement in the world, and people hold on to it. And so Jesus makes this promise that rings through the ages. It's important. It's a powerful promise. And you would think that his audience would be like, that's amazing, that we can follow you and we can be free. And yet they don't take it that way at all. In the next verse, in John 8:33, it says, they answered him, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we will be set free? Rather than receiving a promise and accepting an offer, they're offended. They're turned off. It's just taken three verses for these people to go from being his disciples to being offended by him. And it was because he made them a promise. You see how now that there's a failure to communicate here, that there's a struggle for them to hear him. He's given them something very good and they've taken it as something bad. And Jesus then lays on them the truth that they have been avoiding. Jesus replied, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins. How many of those guys standing there and those gals, whatever the genders were, how many of those people do you think had sinned? What percentage? All of them, right? And Jesus is saying, look, you're standing here all guilty of sin. And the reason for that is that, you know the right thing to do. You know the good thing to do. You surely didn't want to do the bad thing, and yet you have. Well, why is that? Well, because you're a slave to sin, and that's what people don't want to hear. You see, the lie that all unbelievers have in common is that you are essentially good, or at least, if you know that you're not essentially good, you're capable of becoming good. And Jesus is saying, that's the lie. That's the thing that has caused you to be offended by me. That you want to bring your virtues, you want to bring your strengths, you want to bring your capabilities and all of the nice things you've done and all the bad things you've not done, and you want to keep this ledger and you want to bring it to God, and that pursuit is the lie. And so whether somebody's an atheist and they say, look, I don't like when you talk about sin. I don't like this God that you talk about because there's an accountability there. Atheists will say that they're entirely objective. They're not. Nobody is. That the lie that they believe is that they're good enough, that they are basically good, that humans are basically good. I mean, you got to meet some more humans then, I mean, people are not, they're not that good, and the more we know, the harder it is to believe that they're basically good. And if they're not basically good, I'm probably not basically good either under the right circumstances. And that's the thing is that we live under this veneer that hey, we're decent people, but the fact is that we live in a civilized society. We're not under these kinds of survival pressure and need. We're not being confronted and hounded in ways that might cause us to show our darker side. And yet Jesus is saying, if there's sin there, then that darker side is there. And you just believed a lie about who you really are. And so atheists, they don't like to believe in a God who has standards. And Muslims, they don't like to believe that they can't meet God's standards. So one says, well, I'm not a slave to sin because sin isn't a thing. And the other says, I'm not a slave to sin. Sin is a thing, but I can overcome it eventually. And both of those are essentially the same belief. And they're the same reason that everybody rejects Christ, because Jesus has given us the means of seeing the truth. And that is in John 8:28a. So Jesus said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, that's himself, then you will know that I am he. Now, when he says lifted up, he doesn't mean that we will somehow worship him as he deserves, that we will exalt him. He's saying to the Jews, to the people that God has been working with for centuries, to God's own chosen people, he's saying, when you have hanged me on a cross, you'll see yourself. And in seeing yourself, you'll see me. That is the code key. That is the cipher that unlocks God's language, which is truth. That at the cross, we find an invitation to truth. And if we accept it, all other truths come in its wake. And armed with truth, we can be set free.